This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Of course, we spend a small fortune on beautiful BC, as we should, making sure that tourists come here, because tourism is, after all, one of our major resources. The problem is that we're not spending as much on maintaining the very things that people come to see, namely our parks. In fact, we're losing park rangers and other people who should be taking care of these places for us. Why is all this happening? Well, the perfect person to explain all that, of course, is Gwen Barlee, who's the policy director for wildernesscommittee.org. Hello, Gwen.
Hello.
And you're not carrying a tent on your back for
no,
once.
not today.
You didn't bring a shovel?
No,
yeah, okay.
no.
So let's get to some numbers. What is it that we're spending on marketing, which we should? 47 million, 41 million?
It's around that. It's an astronomical amount of money. And then you look at what the park budget is for British Columbia, and it's just $30 million, and that's remained unchanged for years. And what the Wilderness Committee did, I was kind of curious to see how BC compared to other jurisdictions. And I looked at the amount we spent per hectare right across North America. And there isn't a jurisdiction in North America, whether it's a territorial government, whether it's a province or a state, that spends less per hectare than British Columbia does.
And we are supernatural BC.
We are supernatural
So you're telling
BC.
us that the folks who manage the Grand Canyon, the folks who manage one desert or another, they're spending...
Well, they value the park system, and they realize that you can't just give it lip service, that you actually need to put money into parks and make sure they're protected. And another thing that really surprises people is about 14% of the land base in British Columbia is protected.
Yes.
It's around 14 million hectares, and we have 1,000 parks in protected areas, and we have just 11 full-time park rangers.
Excuse me?
11.
11.
Yeah,
they must be very tired.
They must be very tired. Yeah. And I had to get that through a Freedom of Information request, because I asked the government, I said, how many park rangers do we have that are year-round?
Yeah.
And they wouldn't answer that question. And I thought, I bet there's something embarrassing there. And so then I did a Freedom of Information request asking that, and I was astounded. I mean, you can't have 11 rangers patrol 14 million hectares of protected areas. That's impossible. And there are more part-time rangers hired in the summer, but that number has continually gone down. And actually, we received information a couple of years ago there'd been another round of cuts to park rangers, and the government had taken away vehicles. They had lowered their gas budget, so park rangers were talking about bringing their bikes out or taking the Greyhound bus to get to their
Remove vehicles? You mean they've said the government has said, look, you've got 10 vehicles, you should only have 4?
That's what was happening, and it went even further than that. There wasn't even enough money. Rangers were asking the government, we don't have toilet paper for this outhouse, or the floorboards are rotting in this outhouse and we'd like to replace them, or there's a bridge that emergency vehicles use and we'd like to replace the lug nuts. And they couldn't even get money, or they were asking for money for avalanche signs. And that was actually happening near the 100-year anniversary, which was in 2011, of our park system. And it just makes you shake your head that people in BC know our parks are important, and they want to see them adequately protected, and we need to have a proper budget if we're to do that.
I could take people to a number of offices in Victoria, buildings full of offices, and introduce them to a lot of lug nuts. We spend a lot of money on a lot of paperwork, but here, one of our greatest assets, nature, right? I mean, we're all about, in this province, we're about natural resources. Of course, wood, coal, gold, whatever, water, right? Yes. Hydro.
Yes.
But one of the natural resources is just the mere fact of the beautiful topography.
We live in an amazing province and an amazing wildlife and incredible park system, and people come from around the world to see something that they can't see elsewhere.
Right.
You can still see grizzlies in the Kootsmatine.
Yeah.
You can go to Manning Park and explore, wildlife meadows. We have something so precious and special here, and when British Columbia is branding itself to the world, as we did in 2010 during the Winter Olympics.
And as we should.
As we should.
Yeah.
Of course, we have something really special here. How they branded themselves was through showcasing our protected area system. And that's why everyone scratches their head and say, why wouldn't the government adequately staff the park system? Why do we only have 11 full-time park rangers? Why do we have less money invested in our parks per hectare than any other jurisdiction virtually in North America? And I think that's a question that we need to ask the BC government.
And for those of us who live here in the urban gridlock, we tend to forget that this is the smallest part of the province. The province is a bunch of elk and caribou and
grizzly bears
and grizzly bears and so on. And isn't that wonderful?
It is.
And would you not agree, Gwen, that even those of us who do live in the urban and suburban areas, we're a pretty outdoorsy, get out and walk and hike and swim and exercise kind of people?
We are, and it's really nice to be able to take your kids for a walk on a secluded beach, or take your kids for a walk in the forest, and especially nowadays when kids are in front of computers and they're in front of the TV, and to reconnect kids with nature. And because we have such a great protected area system, we can do that, but we need to give it a little bit of TLC. And it was very surprising also last year that the government introduced a bill called Bill 4, and it was the Park Amendment Act. And what that bill allowed the BC government to do was to give permits to resource extraction companies, like logging companies, oil and gas companies, and they would be permitted to do research for industrial purposes within our park system. And then
what's the translation of research?
Exactly. So what they do, so they want to know, where would it be a good place to put the logging road?
Yes.
Where would it be a good place to put this oil and gas line?
Yeah.
And then they can turn around and ask the government to remove that land from the park. And people were outraged. Nobody had been consulted. None of the BC public had been consulted. And within 2 weeks of that legislation passing, there were 168,000 people who signed a petition saying, we need to revoke Bill 4. We don't need to make it easier for oil and gas companies and logging companies to take land out of our protected area system. And how the Wilderness Committee actually found out about it, someone tipped me off and they said, it was I guess it was probably November, December of 2013, and they said, you need to go to the BC government's website, and it's where they post Freedom of Information requests, and that's where you can access government documents. And they said, and there was a briefing note book for Mary Pollock, and they said, go to page, I think it was 498 of that briefing book, and take a look at it. And I went to page 498 of Mary Pollock's briefing book, and she's the Minister of Environment for British Columbia.
Right.
And there was a list of parks, over 30, 35 parks, that could potentially have their boundaries adjusted for LNG, for oil and gas, for logging companies.
Yes.
And I was just absolutely astounded. And what the government had been doing is they'd been giving these companies permits and allowing them to go into parks and do this industrial research when they probably didn't have the statutory authority to do so. And then that's why the government introduced Bill 4, which enabled companies to then be legally allowed to do industrial research.
It's interesting, isn't it, Gwen Barlee, the way we use language and the way governments in particular use language.
Yes.
We're just having a minor boundary adjustment.
Yes.
Yeah.
We want clarity. What's wrong with research?
Yeah. A little boundary adjustment means, I forgot to tell you there's going to be a major mine here.
Or to give you an example, right now there's a park called Sasquatch Park. It's outside. It's by Harrison Hot Springs.
Yes.
And it's a fairly small park. I think it's around 3,000 hectares, and over 300,000 people come to visit it every year. And there's an old road through the park, a gravel road that people can access their campsites.
Right.
And there's an application right now before the provincial government. A logging company wants to put logging trucks and haul timber through that road, and that would be a park boundary adjustment. And so you'd have people walking along the road with their dogs and their kids, and you'd have logging truck.
How do you deal with the people who will just point at you and say, "Oh, tree hugger, what does she know? We have to have mining. We have to have lumber."
The thing is, and my dad was actually in the mining industry, and I went gold panning as a kid. In government.
Yeah.
And we have 86% of the province that's open for development in British Columbia.
Yes.
And we just have 14% set aside in protected areas. And the reason why protected areas were created in the first place was to protect them from industrial development.
Oddly enough.
And so when you talk to people in British Columbia, they don't want to see our parks with logging roads in them. They don't want to see them with transmission lines in them, because then they aren't really parks if they're being bisected by this industrial development. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why the BC government didn't consult British Columbians when they passed this legislation.
And one of the other things that British Columbians, especially people who like to go outdoors, do not want to see is that their camping fees are raised by 200%.
I know you pay more for BC parks and get less.
Yes.
So here the government is constantly raising camping fees, and things are expensive in British Columbia.
Yes.
And parks are a refuge, and people are nearly being priced out of our provincial parks. And that sort of comes on the tail end of the government, again with no public consultation, deciding to put parking meters in 42 of the most popular parks in British Columbia.
Excuse me? Parking meters?
Yeah. And again, no public consultation.
How bizarre.
It was bizarre, and it infuriated people. So they put the parking meters in, and we were doing a park tour that year, the Wilderness Committee. And when we were going to these front country popular parks, we noticed that the parking lots were half empty. And I thought, I bet that the parking meters have driven away British Columbians from visiting these parks. And so we submitted a Freedom of Information request, and we found out the government had missed its revenue targets by over 90% and had driven away over 1 million British Columbians from visiting those parks, because people didn't, and rightfully so, didn't want to have to pay to visit a provincial park, which we own.
I'm not going to drive 200K, right, with a car full of screaming kids, right, and search for coins to put in a meter. It's
just wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what people found.
There's a kind of naturally intuitive reaction of, what, are you kidding me?
Yes. And so after pointing that out, they couldn't dispute the numbers. And then the government pulled the parking meters from BC's parks, which was a move in the right direction. But we also don't have things like interpretive programs in our parks. We don't have government-funded interpretive programs. And I think it's only Mississippi and British Columbia that are the only jurisdictions in North America that have no government-funded interpretive programs. And so here we are, 11 park rangers for over 1,000 parks and protected areas, no interpretive programs, the lowest funding per hectare in North America.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the park rangers again, because I was going to say, boys and girls, this is not a career path, right?
No, not anymore.
I mean, what if people are interested in the great outdoors, and they study ecology, and they study all kinds of sciences, and they'd like to make that their life's work? You
have a better chance of winning the lottery, pretty much, than being a full-time.
You might as well try being an actor and get a part in a big movie.
Yeah, pretty much. And also, park rangers not only make our parks safe and police and enforce the Parks Act, they also rescue people. And there was, when the government had done this big round of cuts to park rangers, they talked to some of the rangers whose positions had been cut and who had actually saved people's lives, that people that had gotten into trouble in a lake in a park and couldn't get themselves out of trouble, and it was a park ranger who actually saved their lives. And parks are important, and I think we need to fund them properly.
We'll take a little breather here. Our chance for you to send us a note to davidberner.com. Always happy to hear from you, and also the opportunity for those lovely people who support our program to say hello here on Shaw Community Television. Cable 4 will be back in a moment. I should have cut down a tree for this.
No.
This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works.
Thank you. All right, 35 years and 60,000 members. That's the wildernesscommittee.org, and their policy director, Gwen Barlee, is with us here. And you're involved in a lot of issues. But before we get to a few of the others, let's just continue on this parks thing. 27 full-time park rangers only about 10 years ago,
yes.
and now we're down to 11. So we're going backwards.
We are.
Reducing services, like what?
Well,
besides no toilet paper.
Besides no toilet paper, not repairing outhouse floors.
Yeah.
They've also shortened the season, so some parks open later, close earlier. They're behind in, again, no interpretive programs. They cut the interpretive programs.
They must be getting their policy directives from the city, who do things like close libraries on Sunday.
I know, and the other thing that's interesting is the BC government has done several studies looking at the economic benefits of provincial parks, and they show that for every $1 that's invested, there's $8 that are generated in visitor expenditures that go into nearby communities, and so parks more than pay for themselves. Instead of that money going to general revenue, it needs to go into a park investment fund.
I was about to say, well, why is it in general revenue?
Good question.
Because that's a good way to hide things.
Yes, it is.
That's the reason it's in general revenue. Why aren't funds from parks in the park fund so we can see them?
Well, I agree. And when parks are making money hand over fist, when they're part of what makes BC a special place to live, why isn't the government putting that money into a designated park fund, and then we can properly fund our park system from that park fund?
Simple question, and you can't answer it if you hesitate. You have to answer.
Okay, I'll try to do my best.
You have to just answer really quickly for the honest answer.
Okay.
Parks in BC, money makers?
Yes.
Okay, money losers?
No.
No. Simple, right?
Yes, it is simple.
So why don't we invest in things that work?
I don't know why.
Isn't that what business people do?
They do that. I scratched my head for many years on this, and I don't understand when British Columbians, and the government's done lots of polling on this, and it's off the charts, British Columbians value our parks.
Absolutely.
And they want to take their kids to our parks, and they want to get close to nature. And our parks are a great way to do that. And I don't understand when the government knows that, and knows that our BC parks make money for public coffers, why the government won't fund them properly. And it's a mystery.
I'm wondering, it was about a dozen or so years ago under Gordon Campbell that this province became somewhat obsessed with the 3 Ps, with the private-public partnerships. Is that a holdover? Is our Families First premier somewhat obsessed with we don't know. I mean,
I don't know, because let's take it for face value. Families First.
Yes.
Surely, if it was Families First,
I've asked you never to call me Shirley in public. That's a private thing between us. Yeah.
I won't say that again.
Okay.
But why, if it was Families First, you want to get BC families into parks.
Yeah.
You can help. I mean, obesity is a growing concern. Kids' disconnection from nature is a growing concern. And parks are
Diabetes is a major growing concern.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And parks are a perfect way to reconnect kids with nature, to get families out in nature, to have reasonably priced vacations at campgrounds. And and the government's own polls show that parks make money, that people value parks. I just don't know. I don't know why it falls on deaf ears, and why the government's actually making it easier for resource extraction companies in British Columbia to take lands out of our park system, and again, without consulting the public.
Let's look at a few other things. Wilderness Committee is involved in a huge array of issues. Okay.
Yeah, environmental issues, but we probably have about 25 different issues that we work on in the environment.
At any moment.
Yeah.
So tell me about wood fiber LNG. What's that?
Well,
about?
wood fiber LNG is not my campaign, so I'll do my best to. It's a proposal, and it's near Squamish, to have an LNG, a smaller LNG plant come online. The community, there's growing opposition, and I'd probably say the majority of people are probably very concerned about that LNG plant. I think the government is desperate to see any type of LNG plant be built in British Columbia.
Yes.
That they really promised in the last election that we were going to, I think, wipe out the provincial debt, have a $100 billion prosperity fund.
The Premier has taken to signing her personal notes, LNG. She puts Chris.
Pretty much,
LNG.
but the market has tanked in North America for LNG, and so they're pinning their hopes and betting the farm on the market staying strong in Asia. And that's looking iffy. And so it might be the market decides that we don't have LNG in British Columbia. And obviously there's a carbon footprint, and there's also
Yes.
when you frack, you use an enormous amount of fresh water.
Does the Wilderness Committee have a particular relationship with Aboriginal leaders?
We work very closely with First Nations governments right across British Columbia. We believe strongly in title and rights. And we have a very good working history with First Nations across the province.
And are you able to say to those naysayers, those people who will call you tree huggers and so on, are you able to say, look, we believe in mines and lumber and so on?
But let's just do it right in an environmentally sensitive manner. Let's not squander environmental protection. Let's not have another Mount Polley. And again, I grew up, my dad was a placer miner for many years, and I went gold panning with him at claims in Rock Creek and on the Tulameen River. I love gold panning.
Yes.
And
Did you become very rich?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
But it's nothing's more exciting
Yeah.
than you're panning and panning. It's back-breaking work.
Yes.
And you get down to black sand,
Yes.
and then you see a nugget in your pan against the black sand. It's
nugget
very
in your
exciting.
pan.
It's
Wow.
very exciting.
Well, that's an image I'm going to hold on.
It really
to.
is. When you pluck it, it's like a $50 bill floating in your pan.
Okay.
So what we're saying is let's do it right. We've had a federal government that's gutted environmental protection. We've had a provincial government that over the last 14 years has also gutted environmental protection. We don't have scientists and hydrologists and people with their biologists with their boots on the ground. We're one of only 2 provinces in all of Canada that has no endangered species legislation.
We don't?
No, I know most people don't know.
I didn't know that.
I know, they're astounded. And we have 1,900 species at risk. So that ranges from killer whales to Vancouver Island marmots to plant species like the phantom orchid.
So how about bees? Because one of your campaigns is about some strange insecticide, not insecticide.
It's hard to
What is
pronounce. It is an insecticide.
An insecticide
It's called
that's-
neonicotinoids.
Gesundheit.
And no one can pronounce that, so we call them neonics.
Neonics. Yeah.
And they're profoundly, profoundly toxic to bees. And 1 teaspoon of neonics can kill hundreds of millions of bees.
Really?
Yes. And so in Europe, they've had bee kills for years and years and years. And in British Columbia and in North America, we've also had bee kills. And it coincides, these very dramatic bee kills, with the use of neonicotinoid pesticides.
So we're trying to get this thing stopped.
We want them banned.
Totally.
And just to give you one example, there's one beekeeper out east, and neonics are heavily used on corn.
Yes.
And so about 100% of corn seeds that are planted, let's say in Ontario, are pre-treated with this deadly class of pesticides. And when they were planting the corn seeds in 2012 and 2013, the toxins affected bees that were in the neighboring areas, and hundreds of millions of bees died.
Really?
Yeah, and the beekeepers felt that neonicotinoids were directly responsible for that. So they got Health Canada to test those bees, the dead bees. And Health Canada found the vast majority of those bees had neonicotinoid residue on them. And so it's, by weight, neonicotinoids are 5,000 to 10,000 times more toxic than DDT. So Europe has now introduced a 2-year moratorium on 3 of the most dangerous classes of neonicotinoids. Ontario has said they want to reduce, after these horrible bee deaths, hundreds of millions of bees, they want to reduce the use of neonicotinoids by 80% on corn and soy seeds. And so what the Wilderness Committee is saying is it's known. There's hundreds of scientific studies that show how deadly neonics are to bees, kill them outright, but also cause sublethal impacts, which cause them to become disoriented.
And if you're not sensitive to the lives of bees, guess what goes up in price every week?
Food. 1 out of every 3 bites of what we eat is provided by bees.
Yeah.
So we need a ban on neonicotinoids. And preliminary studies are showing that neonics were introduced because they were supposed to increase yields.
Yes.
If you put them on your soybeans, if you put them on your corn, you'll get more corn, you'll get more soybeans. And so the U.S. government examined the use of neonics on soybeans, and they found it didn't increase yield.
Yeah, well, of course, we have a problem, which is a 2-hour discussion about corn. We want,
Yes, we do.
we want corn to run the world. I mean, it's going to run our cars. It's going to do lights. It's going to do everything.
We just can't be killing bees.
We just can't make any more tacos because we can't afford corn.
Yeah.
Well, we just have 2 minutes left, Gwen. What can people do in this struggle about the parks? Let's go back to the parks because that's our main
Keep
concern.
the faith and realize that you're in good company.
Yes.
Over 90% of British Columbians feel very strong strongly about parks and want them properly protected. I would encourage people to drop by the Wilderness Committee website, which is wildernesscommittee.org,
Right.
and phone up your MLA, your member of the Legislative Assembly, or email your member of the Legislative Assembly and let them know how you feel and say, part of my British Columbia is having a properly funded and protected park system, and I would like the provincial government to do the right thing. And it could be that easy, or if you feel really like a little bit of extra get up and go, write a letter to a newspaper. Make sure it's under 200 words.
Yes.
But we live in a democracy still, and we have to speak up and let the government know parks are important.
And governments never forget that governments are interested in one thing: votes.
Typically, yes.
Yeah, that's what will move them.
Yes, and also, but if they know their constituents, and again, my dad was in politics previously, and if he got 10 or 15 handwritten letters or phone calls in his riding on a particular
He was
issue,
moved into action.
he paid attention.
Yeah. Gwen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This has been delightful. It's been great. It's scary, but wonderful. So, folks, that's it for this week. Next week, Turning Point Recovery, which has been in business for 33 years and is in communities all around the Lower Mainland, is trying to open a 9-bed facility in a very Tony neighborhood up by Mount Seymour Parkway. And I went to 2 public lynchings. It was a little scary. The District of North Vancouver is doing its best to hear what people have to say. So the Executive Director, Brenda Plant, will be with us next week. Thanks so much for being with us here today on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Good night.